Our uniforms grew darker as the earth darkened, almost as if by magic, and our footsteps seemed to be setting the rhythm of the whole mysterious universe. The blackness of night was spreading behind us, and we fell silent, hushed by the respect which immensity imposes on simple men. Our group of soldiers, members of an army hated throughout the world, was seized by an indefinable emotion. As one sometimes jokes, to hide sadness, we began to sing to avoid thought. The favourite song of the SS rose up like a hymn to the earth, offered to men. Then darkness engulfed us, a darkness which, for the first time in months, seemed made for nothing more than watching over us. Although we had begun to feel our exhaustion, no one suggested a halt. The road home was long, and we didn't want to lose any time. For me, hoping to reach my other country, the road was even longer. Although our leave did not officially begin until Poznan, the idea of getting home overrode every other consideration and enabled me to endure the painful condition of my bare feet, rubbed raw by my boots. Hulls, who was having the same sort of trouble, cursed the storekeeper at Aktyrka for failing to supply us with socks. After about 20 miles, we were forced to reduce our speed. Naturally, the veterans who had joined us, and whose feet must have been made of iron, treated us like crybabies. But they gave us their own socks, so that we could go on. For a few of us, however, this was not enough. Our feet were too lacerated, and the 3 additional miles we were able to manage cost us too much pain. As the rest of the group kept on despite our cries pleading for a halt, we decided to try walking barefoot on the dewy grass. At first this seemed like an improvement, but not for long. Some even thought of wrapping their feet in the new undershirts we had been issued, but the possibility of an inspection made them hesitate. The last few miles, as we hobbled through the growing daylight, were torture, a torture refined by the first military police we met on the outskirts of Romny, who made us put back our boots. They said they wouldn't allow us into town looking like a bunch of tramps. We could have murdered them. Further on, we asked some gypsies to take the worst cases as far as the commandantur in their carts. They were prudent enough not to argue. The infirmary was in the same building as the commandantur. We even spoke with the commandant, who was outraged that soldiers from the Grossdeutschland should have to go without socks. He sent an official statement of indignation to the Aktyrka camp for failing to provide properly for new troops. Those who wished medical attention were sent to the infirmary, where their feet were washed in basins of warm water to which chloroform had been added. This had an extraordinary effect, easing our pain almost at once. We were each given a small red metal box of cream for coating our feet before setting out on a march, but we still had no socks. Those of our group who had not gone to the infirmary were looking into the prospects for the rest of our journey. The Kharkov-Kiev line ran through Romny, with daily trains in both directions. Our disappointment, therefore, was great when our 2 Feldwebels announced that we wouldn't be leaving for at least 2 days. All available space on trains moving toward the front was reserved for essentials, and on returning trains emergencies were given priority over soldiers on leave. Rumours multiplied among our group of 500 anxious men for whom each hour counted. People spoke of leaving for Kiev on their own, thumbing a ride on one of the convoys, or sneaking onto a train on the quiet, or stealing some Russian horses. Some even spoke of doing the journey on foot, 150 miles, which would take at least 5 days, even with forced marches. As all of these were really out of the question, we decided it would be better simply to stay where we were. Old Hans groaned. "I can tell you, we'll just sit here and watch our passes expire. We've got to get out of here. Who says we'll leave in 2 days? We'll probably be right where we are a week from now, so fuck the whole damn mess. I'm clearing out." My feet were still feeling too sensitive even to think about a march, no matter how pressing it might be. Hals and Lenson were in the same state, so for better or for worse we had to wait in Romny without any idea of what to do or even where to sleep. The police were always after us, telling us to move on. It was useless to try to explain to them. The bastards weren't interested. In the Ukraine, that paradise for troops on leave, they had rediscovered all the exasperating authority they exercised in peacetime. Anyone rash enough to argue with them risked having his pass torn up in front of his eyes. We saw this happen to one poor devil about 40 years old. The gendarmes kicked his pack like some kind of football, and the fellow remarked in an angry voice that he had just spent 6 months fighting in the Caucasus and felt entitled to a certain amount of common courtesy. "Traitors!" shouted one of the horrible cops. "Traitors who ran away from the Russians and lost Rostov. They should send the whole lot of you back to the front, which you never should have left in the first place." And he ripped the poor man's pass into shreds before his horrified eyes. We thought he would break down and howl. Instead, he threw himself on the 2 cops, knocking both of them flat. He was gone before we could recover from our stupefaction. The furious cops picked themselves up, swearing to have the man shot. We took ourselves off in a hurry before they had the chance to turn their guns on us. 2 days later, we left for Kiev after all, crammed into a train which was also loaded with cattle. But we didn't care about travelling in comfort. We were interested only in getting to Kiev, which, several months before its destruction, was still a beautiful city. In Kiev, we felt that we had been saved, that the war no longer existed. The city looked beautiful and was full of flowers. People were going quietly about their ordinary, everyday occupations. White streetcars edged in red moved through the brightly dressed civilian crowds of the pleasant town. Everywhere, troops in trim, brushed uniforms were walking with Ukrainian girls. I had already liked the look of the town in the winter. Now all my agreeable impressions were confirmed. I would gladly have ended the war right there. From Kiev, we had no trouble finding a train leaving for Poland. Our journey was vivid and colourful. We left in a crowded civilian train and mixed in this way with ordinary Russian people, had more of a chance to become acquainted with them than at any time during the war. Our train of oddly assorted carriages rolled for hours along a track that crossed the empty expanse of the Pripyat marshes. The Russians, who drank and sang non-stop, offered drinks to all the soldiers too, and the noise throughout the journey was almost beyond belief. At the occasional station stops, people got on and off, and the most outrageous jokes were cracked amid shouts of laughter. The women made even more noise than the men. Hals put on a gorharichka for a short time. We passed in this way from the Ukraine into Poland, arriving after 2.5 days in Lublin, where we had to change trains. At Lublin there was also a meticulous police inspection, and we were ordered to go to the camp barber for haircuts before departure. However, our anxiety about missing the train was so great that we decided to take what seemed like an enormous risk, which succeeded. Hals, Lenson and I managed to walk out past the military police with our hair untouched by any shears. This proved to have been a risk well worth taking, as without it we would surely have missed the train. We arrived at Poznan in the middle of the night and were received by a very efficient centre. We were given tickets for the canteen and the dormitory and told to be at the office in the morning to have our passes validated. The office was open from 7 to 11, but we were warned to be there no later than 6, as there was usually a queue. This struck us as somewhat strange. In effect, it meant that troops arriving in Poznan at 11:05 in the morning had to wait until the following day before they could continue their journey. I think this arrangement was probably motivated by a desire to keep men under army control, even when they were theoretically on leave. In this way, a cancellation order could be sent east while the troops were waiting. By contrast, the office which processed returning troops was open 24 hours a day. We spent what was left of the night in a comfortable dormitory, which reminded me of the barracks at Chemnitz, and were at the office for passes by 6 the next morning. There were already some 20 men ahead of us, who must have spent the night on the spot, and by 7 there must have been at least 300. The self-important bureaucrats who ran the place took their own time verifying our documents, while we stood in agitated silence. The police standing by the door were ready to cancel the leave of anyone foolish enough to lose his temper. When our papers had been stamped, we were sent across the courtyard into a large hall where our uniforms were inspected. We were given the opportunity to polish our boots and brush our clothes beforehand, and one might almost have believed that there was no mud in Russia. Then, a final, charming detail. Women soldiers distributed packages of choice foods wrapped in paper covered with eagles and swastikas and inscribed, "A happy holiday to our brave soldiers. Sweet, sensitive Germany." Howells, who would have been capable of killing himself for a cup of beef broth, rolled enormous eyes. If we'd only had something like this at Kharkov. We felt profoundly moved by these attentions. A package of sausages, jam, and cigarettes seemed generous repayment for our endless nights in the stone-cracking cold and our wanderings through the mud of the Don Valley. Hals and I set off for Berlin, bearing our gifts. Lenson left us to travel to his native Prussia. In Berlin, we were once again reminded of the war's existence. Around the Silesian station and in the Weissensee and Pankow districts, many buildings had been reduced to rubble in the first stages of the city's destruction. But otherwise, the active, busy life of a capital metropolis went on as usual. In Berlin, which I was seeing for the first time, I was reminded of a promise I had made. I had promised myself to go see Ernst Neubach's wife. She lived with his parents in the southern part of the city. I explained this to Howells, who advised me to postpone the obligation until my return trip. But I knew very well that I would never be able to bring myself to leave home a day early, and that my parents would try to hang on to me until the last moment. Howells understood this, even though he tried to persuade me to do something else. He didn't want to lose any time either, and left for Dortmund as soon as he could, making me promise to come to see him. I would have done better to listen to the voice of wisdom, speaking through my friend. My journey came to an end the next day, in the flames of Magdeburg, and I had to stay in Berlin, a city entirely unknown to me. I had to work hard to make myself understood. Still carrying my pack and gun, which were beginning to feel very heavy, I set out to find the Neubach's house. Fortunately, I was still able to read the scribbled address I had found among my poor friend's papers. But should I try to get there by subway or by bus? As I really didn't know where I was going, I decided to proceed on foot, which would at least give me the chance to look around. The idea of walking across the city still seemed normal at that time. However, I didn't want to stray too far afield, to walk west when I should have been walking south. I had noticed a sign, Berlin Sud, which must be roughly correct. I passed 2 cops who gave me a long, cold stare when they noticed the spectacular package of a soldier on leave. I saluted them as required. One had to salute those bastards as if they were army officers, and went on my way. The city seemed beautiful, but serious and well organized. The bombing had only recently begun, and in Berlin it affected only the districts immediately around the railway stations. In this large, imposing town, with its austere houses set off by sumptuous, intricate railings, everything seemed to be regulated by a precise, organized rhythm. No raucous crowds or parents pulling down their children's pants to let them pee. Men, women, children, bicycles, cars, and trucks all seemed to be moving at an even, regular pace toward a precise destination, with a rhythm that seemed conscious and assertive, and designed to avoid any dissipation of energy. It was all very different from Paris, for example. Undue haste seemed out of place, and my legs seemed to fall instinctively into the accepted tempo of the city. To stop moving without good reason would have seemed strange. The huge machine which the regime had set in motion for the cause was turning, and this was evident even in the gestures of the little old lady who was walking just ahead of me, and whom I stopped to ask for directions. Her neat white hair was impeccable, like the streets and the railings and the edges of the sidewalks. The sound of my voice seemed to call her back from some distant daydream. "Excuse me, gnädige Frau," I said, feeling somewhat embarrassed, as if I was speaking in a theatre where the play had already begun. "Could you give me some directions? I am going to this address." I showed her my scrap of paper, which really looked like something pulled out of a wastepaper basket. The old lady smiled, as if she had seen an angel. "It's very far, young man," she said in a gentle voice which suddenly reminded me of my childhood. "It's very far. You must go to the Tempelhof Autobahn, but it's really very far." "That doesn't matter." I couldn't think of anything else to say. "You really ought to take a bus. It would be much easier for you." That doesn't matter, I repeated, like someone in a dream. In fact, I couldn't think of the German words for anything else. This woman's obvious goodness, after so much loud-mouthed bullying and malignity, moved me even more deeply than the exhausted men at Oceni. I don't mind walking. I'm in the infantry, I finally said, smiling. I know, she said, smiling even more tenderly than a moment before. You must be used to walking. I'll go with you as far as the Schloss von Kaiser Wilhelm. From there I'll be able to explain to you. She walked along beside me. As I didn't know what to say, the burden of the conversation fell on her. Where have you come from, young man? From Russia. Russia's a big country. What part were you in? Russia's very big, yes. I was in the south, around Kharkov. Kharkov, she said, giving the name a very German sound. I see. Is it a big town? Yes, it's big. For my kindly companion, Kharkov was clearly nothing more than a name which there was no particular need to remember. For me, Kharkov meant a city which had lost its life. If it had ever been a big town, it was now only a heap of rubble, crowned by a cloud of dust, smoke, and fire. It was also the sound of cries and moaning one shouldn't hear in towns. It was a long corridor of stiffened corpses we had to drag out into the air, and 3 Bolsheviks tied to a fence with their guts spilling from their bellies. My son is in Bryansk, the old lady remarked, clearly hoping for news of the front. Bryansk, I repeated in a thoughtful tone. I believe that's in the central sector. I've never been there. He tells me that everything's going quite well. He's a first lieutenant in an armoured division. A lieutenant, I thought. An officer. The opinions of a private soldier must have sounded ridiculous. Were things difficult in your sector? Things were pretty hard, but they're better now. I'm on leave, I added, smiling. I'm really happy for you, young man, she said, and her voice sounded as if she meant it. Are you in Berlin to see your family? No, gnädige Frau. I'm going to see the parents of a friend. A friend? Ernst. A corpse. What friend was I tramping along like this for? The old woman was beginning to get on my nerves. A friend from your regiment, she said, sharing my pleasure at being on leave. I felt like knocking her onto one of those intricate railings full of spikes. Where do your parents come from? She asked. From Wissembourg, in Alsace. She looked at me with surprise. So you're Alsatian. I know Alsace very well. I almost told her that she knew it better than I did. Yes, I'm Alsatian, I said, hoping to get a little peace. She began to tell me about a trip she'd taken to Strasbourg, but I wasn't listening anymore. By forcing me to remember Ernst, she had irritated me. I had better things to do than listen to this old bird reminisce about her travels. It was a beautiful day, I was on leave, and I needed to see something gay. This desire made me wonder what attitude to take when I got to the Neubachs. These people had just lost their son and were probably overwhelmed by grief. Maybe they didn't even know he was dead. If that's how it was, what on earth could I say to them? It would be better to visit them on my way back. By then, they would surely have been told. Hals was right. I should have listened to him. He at least was still alive. We came to a crossroad opposite a bridge over a stream, or even perhaps a large river. I knew that the Seine flowed through Paris, but couldn't have said whether Berlin was on the Elbe or the Oder. To the right there was a massive block of buildings, the Schloss von Kaiser Wilhelm, and directly across the avenue an impressive memorial to the heroes of 1914 to 18. 1,200 helmets of that time set round a forecourt to give some idea of the sacrifice. 2 sentries from Hitler's guard walked slowly back and forth along a cement apron at the base of the monument. Their slow, even pace seemed to me strangely symbolic of a human being's slow progress toward eternity. With a regularity which a master watchmaker might well have envied, the 2 men executed impeccably synchronized half-turns, faced each other at a distance of about 30 meters, resumed their march, crossed, turned, and began again. I found this spectacle somehow oppressive. "Here we are, young man," the old woman said. "You cross the bridge and follow that avenue." She pointed toward the vast, stony backdrop of the city, in which I would have to find my address. But I had already stopped listening. I knew that I wasn't going to the Neubachs, and that these explanations were superfluous. Nevertheless, I outdid myself in expressions of gratitude, and pressed the old lady's hand. She withdrew, repeating her protestations of goodwill. I couldn't help smiling. As soon as she had disappeared, I rushed back in the direction from which we'd come, trying to make up for lost time, and find the station for the west as quickly as possible. I walked along the riverbank with the obsessive speed of a maniac. Suddenly the air filled with martial music, and an elegantly dressed military band marched out through a tall gateway and turned into the street. I remembered what we were taught at Bialystok and snapped to attention, presenting arms to the indifferent troop. After an hour and a half, with innumerable stops to ask my way, I arrived at the station from which trains left for the west and France. I looked desperately for Hulls amid the throngs on the platform. He would surely be on this train too, but I couldn't find him in the few minutes before departure. As I caught my breath on the train, the slow, regular progress of our acceleration seemed to merge with the measured tempo of the German capital. Everything here was so entirely different from Russia. Even the soldiers had an air of seriousness which matched the civilized, organized life of all large European countries. The contrast with Russia was so great that I wondered if what I'd seen there wasn't part of a bad dream. Night fell and the train rolled on. We had been moving for at least. Night fell and the train rolled on. We had been moving for at least 3 hours, during which it seemed that we had never left the city. There was no countryside, only buildings. Suddenly the train came to a stop, although we were not in a station. Everyone leaned out the windows to see what was happening. Although it was dark, the distant sky glowed with red light. We could hear a muffled rumbling mingled with the boom of guns. The throbbing of a mass of airplanes overhead rattled the windows of the train. "That must be Magdeburg, getting it in the neck," said a soldier who had shoved in beside me to look out too. "Who's giving it to them?" I asked. He looked at me curiously. "Those Yankee bastards, of course," he said, as if he were talking to a simpleton. "Things are just as hot here as they are at the front." I couldn't tear my eyes away from the glow of the burning city. I had thought that we'd left the war far behind us. The train began to move again, only to come to a fresh halt 15 minutes later. Soldiers ran up the track, calling everybody off. Somebody said that the line had been cut, and that all military personnel, whether on active duty or on leave, had to put themselves at the disposal of the local authorities. Thus I found myself, in my clean uniform and carrying my holiday package, falling into step with about 100 resigned soldiers. We walked for about half an hour into the blinding, acrid smoke of countless fires and began shifting fallen timbers and massive masonry blocks, while delayed action bombs pulverized what was left of a terrified bourgeois population. Groups of whimpering civilians were impressed into clean-up squads by foul-mouthed officials, shouting at the tops of their lungs. Everyone was put to work. Although it was pitch dark, we were able to see. Broken gas pipes thrown up onto the torn earth blazed like blowtorches amid the heaps of stones, broken wood, window glass, furniture, arms and legs. A gang of territorials handed out picks, and we piled the rest of our equipment beside a fire truck. We had to dig into the ruins with the greatest possible speed. We could hear the groans and cries of people trapped in the cellars. Women and children, weeping with terror, were carting away bricks and stones to clear some space. Shouted orders overlapped. "Quick! This way! We need help over here! Quick! The water pipes have burst and are flooding the cellars!" Of course, the military were chosen to deal with the most dangerous situations and sent into places threatened with immediate collapse. We reached the cellars through the deep air shafts. We attacked a brick wall that seemed to be blocking the entrance to a basement where people were calling for help. My pick sank into something soft, probably the stomach of some poor soul crushed by the debris. And damn it, I was on leave, and all of this was holding me up. An explosion shifted the ground we were standing on, another one of those American bombs which blow up some time after they've landed. Nonetheless, our efforts were finally successful. The last brick wall fell beneath our blows, and a bunch of haggard, blackened people surged through the jagged opening, engulfed in a swirling cloud of dust. Several people embraced us, sobbing with relief and recognition. Others were in a state of literal madness. Everyone was somehow hurt or wounded. We had to climb down ourselves to bring out terrified women clutching their children so tightly they were nearly suffocating them. I pulled out the first child I saw. A kid of about 5 was tugging at one of my trouser legs so hard that it came right out of my boot. He was trying to drag me to a particular spot, and he was crying so hard that his gasps for breath between each sob were extraordinarily long. He pulled me over to a recess where a crushed wine bin was holding up the base of a vault on the brink of collapse. An inert human form was lying in the jumble of rubble at my feet. The kid was still howling in a passion of grief that couldn't be helped. I shouted as loud as I could, "Licht aus! Schnell!" Someone came over with a torch, and we saw the body of a woman crushed by the metal of the bottle rack, which had collapsed under the weight of 30 or 40 tons of disintegrating masonry. The body of a child was wedged in beside her. Pulling against the stiff, dusty clothes of the corpse, I dragged out the child's body as if it were just another stone. But maybe the kid was still alive. It seemed to move a little. Dragging the 2 kids with me, I made for the exit hole and handed over the child in my arms to some rescue workers. The one who was howling trailed along with me for a short distance until I abandoned him. He could shift for himself, for God's sake. In Germany, everyone had to be ready for that. The younger, the better. We were already needed for another job. The sirens were howling again. The Anglo-Americans were faithfully adhering to their practice of coming back with a second dose before we had time to help the victims of the first. The gang chiefs blew their whistles for retreat. Voices were shouting, "Everyone take cover!" But where? For 400 yards around us, we could see nothing but heaps of rubble. People who knew the district ran in what they hoped were likely directions. Bewildered children were crying. Above us, we could hear the roar of 4-engined planes. I was running too, and I knew what I was looking for. The fire truck had disappeared, but our heap of packs remained where we'd left them. Soldiers were turning them over, grabbing the right one and running off. I recognized mine by the metal edelweiss I had sewn onto the piece of calf skin which served as a pillow. I pulled it out, along with my gun, but my gift package. God damn it! "Hey, you! My package!" Someone threw me a package across the maelstrom. Everyone was hurrying off. "Hey! This isn't it! Wait a minute! God damn it!" Bombs were beginning to fall at the other end of the city. God damn it to hell! I ran as fast as I could across an empty space where I narrowly escaped a car in as great a hurry as I. The surface of the road seemed to be rising and falling in ripples, and the sound of thousands of panes shattering simultaneously added a crystalline note to the huge shock produced by bombs of 4,000 and 5,000 kilos. The number of people on the street was shrinking rapidly. Only a few fools like myself were still running about looking for shelter. My eyes, stinging from the clouds of acrid dust, could see in the intermittent flashes of white light the outline of the houses bordering the street. On one of the buildings I could make out a white poster with black letters. Shelter, 30 persons. Never mind if there were already 100. I ran down a spiral staircase between the only 2 walls left intact in the building. A dim lamp, which some thoughtful soul had hooked to the wall, lit the turns in the stair. But after 2 spirals, the way was blocked by a large grey cylinder, which was even taller than I. I tried to squeeze through the narrow gap next to the stair wall, but a closer look at the object made my blood freeze. I was pressing myself against an enormous bomb, whose broken wings indicated that it had crashed through every floor of the building from the roof down. It must have weighed at least 4 tons and might explode any minute. I streaked back up the stairs and out the door into the darkness, which flickered unevenly into brilliant light like a huge neon sign. Finally, gasping for breath, I collapsed beside a bench in a square and lay there for about 20 minutes until the sirens sounded the all clear. When everything was quiet again, I went back to the job of cleaning up, from which I was released at the end of the morning. Then I was given the most depressing news of all. I was ready to continue my journey westward. 2 days of my leave had already been wasted, and I couldn't spare another minute. I asked a territorial where I would find the train for Kassel and Frankfurt. He asked for my pass, looked it over, and told me to follow him. He took me to a military police station. I watched through the little window as my pass travelled from hand to hand, keeping my eyes firmly fixed on it. I saw several stamps being added to the scrap of paper I had brought from Aktierke. Then it was handed back to me, and I was informed, in an indifferent, administrative tone, that I could not proceed beyond the Magdeburg sector. Given the location of my army corps, I had come to the extreme western limit of permissible travel. I was absolutely stunned and stood staring at the cops. The shock of disappointment was so great that for a few moments I felt numb. "We can understand that you are upset," one of them said, officially taking note of my condition. "You will be well taken care of at the reception centre here in town." Without a word, I took my pass from the counter, where the cop had put it down when he got tired of holding it out to me, and walked through the door. My throat felt as if it would burst from the effort of holding back my tears. In the street, where the sun continued to shine, I stumbled on in a daze. I could see that people were staring at me as if I were drunk. Suddenly I felt ashamed and looked for some place where I could withdraw for a few minutes to compose myself. A little farther on, I took shelter in the ruins of a large building, collapsing onto a stone in the darkest corner I could find. Clutching my stamp-covered document, I burst into tears like a child. The sound of footsteps made me look up. Someone had followed me into the building, thinking perhaps that I was a thief. When he saw that I was only crying, he turned back to the street. Luckily, people cared more about ration cards than about tears in those days, so at least I was allowed to remain alone with my sorrow. That evening, I caught a train back to Berlin, letting fate dictate that I should call on the Neubacher after all. I didn't know where any of my German relatives lived, although at that time they were quite near Berlin, so I was reduced to either the reception centre or the Neubachs. I felt obsessed by my disappointment. I had been looking forward to this leave so much. And I had earned it too. I had joined the infantry expressly to get it. And now here I was with nothing but a ludicrous scrap of paper. I didn't even have my gift package anymore. It had vanished at Magdeburg, which I had left with a box of some soldier's dirty laundry. Now I would have to show up with empty hands at the house of people I had never met. I certainly didn't have enough money to buy them anything. That evening, I counted myself lucky to get a bed at the reception centre in Berlin. One of the older soldiers there listened to the story of my pass and advised me to speak to a non-com at the registration desk. The non-com turned out to be quite sympathetic, noted down all the details, and told me to come back in 24 hours. Early the next morning, I set out to find the Neubach's house. After several hours of hesitant, groping progress, I finally found myself in front of number 112 Killeringstrasse, a simple 3-story house with a gravelled walk beside it, which could be shut off from the street by a low gate. A young girl who seemed to be about my age was leaning on the bottom half of the front door, looking out into the street. After a moment's hesitation, I went over to ask for a final direction. "Yes, sir," she said, smiling. "This is the right house. They live on the 2nd floor, but at this time of day they're all out at work." "Thank you, miss. Do you know when they'll be back?" "They'll be here this evening, after 7. "Thank you," I said, thinking of the long day ahead of me. What could I do with all that time? As I shut the gate, I thanked the girl once again. She smiled faintly and nodded her head. Who was she waiting for? Certainly not the Neubachs. I had already walked a short way down Killeringstrasse when it occurred to me that I could, at any rate, have talked to the girl a little longer. After several moments of hesitation, I turned back, hoping that she would still be there. Every minute I could subtract from the interminable day ahead seemed like a minute gained. As long as she didn't laugh at me right to my face, I was ready to take almost any amount of sarcasm. I was soon back at number 112. She was exactly where I'd left her. "You think they're already home?" she said, laughing. Of course not. But I feel so lost in this town that I'd rather sit here on the steps and wait than have to hunt for the house all over again. You want to wait here all day? She seemed astonished. I'm afraid so. But you ought to look around Berlin. It's an interesting place. I agree with you, I should. But really, I feel so lost I'm afraid I wouldn't see anything. And I still felt so disappointed that I had no wish to flirt. Are you on leave? Yes, I've still got 12 days, but I'm not allowed to leave the Berlin sector. Are you from the Eastern Front? Yes. It must have been very hard. I can see it on your face. I glanced up at her in surprise. I suspected that I did look like the undertaker's assistant, but for a pretty girl to remark on it after the first few minutes. Then she said something about the people on the 3rd floor, but I wasn't really listening. If she thought I looked as bad as all that, this minuscule conversation that was bringing me somewhat closer to normal life might end at any moment. The idea terrified me. I would have done almost anything to keep this encounter going. I tried to change my expression, to force my mouth to smile, to make myself agreeable. Heavily and clumsily, I asked her if she knew the city. Oh yes, she said, apparently unaware of the trap I was arranging. I've lived in Berlin since before the war. Then she told me about herself, how she studied for part of the day and was a first aid assistant for an 8-hour shift. She was studying for a teacher's license. I listened, but with only half my attention. The simple sound of her voice seemed to wrap me in tenderness. I only wanted it to continue. I tried to look agreeable. When she fell silent, I thrust home with my question. The technique of a Feldwebel. Since you don't have to be at the first aid station until 5, couldn't you show me some of the sights? That is to say, if you don't have anything else to do. She blushed a little. I'd like to, she said, looking down at the ground. But I can't say until I've spoken to Frau X. I no longer remember the woman's name. Oh, well, I've got lots of time. 12 days. She laughed. Good sign, I thought. We talked for about an hour until the good lady arrived. We couldn't avoid the war, of course, although I certainly wanted to, but I did my best to embroider what I said. I described heroic deeds the like of which I'd never seen. I couldn't believe that the filth of the steppe was what this girl wanted to hear about, and I was afraid of speaking too frankly. I didn't want her to understand what our experiences had really been like. I didn't want her to catch the stench of mud and blood through anything I said, or to see the huge grey horizon still stamped across my vision. I was afraid of infecting her with my terror and disgust, and afraid that if I did, she'd resent it. My descriptions of heroism came straight from Hollywood, but at least we were able to laugh, and I could go on talking to her. Finally, Frau X arrived. At first she looked at us disapprovingly. Then Paula, she had told me her name, introduced me as a friend of the Neubachs. To tell you the truth, gnädige Frau, I was a friend of Ernst's. I wanted to visit his family. I understand, young man. Come in and wait in my place. You'll be more comfortable there. Those poor Neubachs. Their courage is almost unbelievable. To think of losing 2 sons in 10 days. It's too awful. My God, I hope this war ends before one of mine is killed. So the Neubachs already knew. They knew not only that Ernst was dead, but another son as well. I hadn't even known that Ernst had a brother. Suddenly, Ernst's death came back to me in all its detail. Ernst, the Don, the Tatra. Ernst, I'll save you. Don't cry, Ernst. These things were blotted out only when I looked at Paula, and they had to be blotted out. I had to forget them. Paula was beside me, smiling. To forget how hard it was. You may wait here, dear sir, or at the Neubachs. Whichever you wish, said the older woman, addressing the boy of 17 like a grown-up gentleman. How was Ernst killed? Forgive me if I don't speak of it, I said, looking down. But looking down was no help. My eyes fell on my boots, the boots which had trampled the earth on Ernst's grave. Everything here kept reminding me, except Paula's smile. You must invent something then, said the kind-hearted woman, guessing at the horror behind my silence. You must spare those poor people." "You can depend on that, gnädige Frau," I said. "I've already had some practice." Frau X changed the subject, which was clearly too painful. She brought out a large bowl of cocoa and milk, and then began talking to Paula, who worked for her as a dressmaker's assistant. "I hope, Paula, that you will entertain our friend Saja here. You should show him Unter den Linden and the Siegersallee. This young man needs some distraction, and that will be your job today." I could have kissed her. "But Frau X, there's all that work I should finish, and—" "Ta-ta-too. You take him on a tour of the capital. There's nothing more urgent." I thanked the kindly woman effusively. Was Paula glad to have a holiday? I didn't really care. I was too pleased with my circumstances to analyse them. We set out, promising to be back for lunch. I walked along beside Paula, struck dumb with pleasure. She tried to fall into step with me, miming my military stride to tease me, but I only laughed. We passed a little booth painted red, where a woman was selling fried fish, and I thought of buying some for Paula. She followed me, smiling her delicious smile. The woman behind the counter prepared 2 helpings of fish on 2 slices of thick bread spread with some kind of ersatz butter. Then she asked for our ration cards. "But I don't have any ration card. I'm here on leave." I smiled, hoping to gain the woman's sympathy. This did no good at all. Paula laughed as though she would burst. I felt ridiculous. "J'aurais tu peux, vermine," I added in French. The fish woman naturally didn't understand me and went on raking out her ashes. We walked off without our fish. Our lunch with Paula's employer crowned my happiness. Despite rationing and shortages, the good-hearted woman had managed to prepare some delicious dishes. She also produced some liqueur, which went straight to my head. I left the table aware of an unusual state of excitement and began to bellow out a marching song, which my 2 companions absolutely could not sing with me. Belatedly coming to my senses, I begged their pardon and then began another song, which was just as objectionable. My hostess seemed amused but somewhat apprehensive. Paula writhed in her seat and stared at me as if I were some kind of grotesque Punch. Her employer, weighing my drunkenness against her concern for her china, suggested to Paula that she take me out for some air. Paula obediently dragged me off, plainly displeased by the company of a drunken soldier who might do something stupid at any moment. On the staircase, my timidity was suddenly overcome by a ludicrous surge of confidence. I grabbed Paula by the waist and spun her into a dance in time to my stamping boots. She frowned and pulled herself away so abruptly that I almost lost my balance. "Stop it, or I won't come with you," she said. This brought me crashing to my senses. The simple fact that she was no longer smiling filled me with anxiety. A fog seemed to have risen between her suddenly hardened eyes and mine, momentarily clouded by a good meal. I felt as if I were back in a foxhole, seeing in a dream a glowing fragment from what had been my youth. I felt chilled to the bone. Perhaps by my stupidity I'd lost Paula already. "Paula!" I cried in desperation. I stood frozen in my tracks. Paula had already reached the bottom of the stairs and was standing in the doorway, framed in sunlight. "All right," she said. "Come along, but pull yourself together." Still somewhat numb, I clutched at my imperiled happiness. "What would you like to see?" "I don't know, Paula. Whatever you like." I felt panic-stricken. Clearly, Paula was exasperated by the company of a drunken enlisted man. I would have to become an officer. Paula was trying to make me decide something I knew nothing about. Inside my head, her irritated voice seemed to blend with the remembered voices of sergeants shouting orders, exhorting me to actions I had no hope of accomplishing. "You there! Jump into that Tatra! Well, have you decided? What would you like to do? Put your foot on the gas. Watch out for that chain. Your uniform is spotted. You have to be more careful. Well, have you decided?" "Yes, Herr Leutnant. Jawohl. Yes, Paula. Of course." Suddenly, she took hold of my sleeve and dragged me from my lethargy. I looked at her. My eyes must have been full of sadness. She seemed astonished. "Let's go to the square anyway," she said. "Then we'll decide something. Come on." She pulled me after her. I let her do it, knowing that if we ran into an officer or one of the military police, my leave would swiftly come to an end in a labour camp. Holding a girl's arm in the street was strictly forbidden, but when I mentioned this to Paula, she only laughed. "Don't worry," she said. "I'm not drunk. I'll be able to see them coming." Finally, as I remained more or less incapable of speech, she took the initiative herself and showed me a round of sights. I stared at them with unseeing eyes. I couldn't shake off the feeling that she was simply doing her duty, that my company was no pleasure for her. And I wanted her to enjoy me as much as I enjoyed her. But that was impossible. There was no reason for her to concede me that happiness. There was no reason either for me to be walking along that clean, well-organized street in a state of disarray, and no reason for anyone to be patient with a poor, befuddled soldier just because he'd spent months wallowing in snow and mud and horror. People at peace with themselves have no idea that anyone unaccustomed to happiness shouts himself breathless in the face of joy. I was the one who had to try to understand, to adapt myself to this mood of tranquility, to avoid shocking anyone, to smile a correct smile, neither too wide nor too tense. At the risk of seeming wild or apathetic, I had to make the effort, to invent and avoid the impression I often felt I was making in France after the war, of telling boring war stories. I often felt like killing the people who then accused me of lying. It is so easy to kill, especially when one no longer feels any particular link with existence. I, a poor bastard soldier in the wrong army, I had to learn how to live because I hadn't been able to die. Why, Paula, did you make a point of the stain on my jacket? Why was a stain enough to erase your smile? Why? And why do I still like to smile? I, who have seen an infinity of horrifying stains. This evening, perhaps, the Neubachs will laugh, Paula, and I will try to laugh too, like you. Paula left me near the Oderbrucker at 5 o'clock, with detailed instructions on how to return to Killeringstrasse. She held my hand as she spoke and smiled, as if in pity. I smiled as if I were happy. "I'll come by the Neubachs for a moment this evening," she said. "Anyway, we'll see each other tomorrow. Good night." "Gute Nacht, Paula." That evening I met the Neubachs. I could easily recognize my friend Ernst in his mother's face. These poor people did not dwell on the double catastrophe which had obliterated all their hopes. The idea of Europe after the war no longer had any meaning for them, because those who should have inherited it no longer existed. But they made heroic efforts to celebrate my passage. The kindly woman from upstairs, who had so generously wet my throat that afternoon, joined us, and Paula came in for a moment about 11. Our eyes met, and Paula saw fit to make a joke about our earlier falling out. I had to preach him a sermon about decent deportment this afternoon. He was singing and dancing right in the middle of the street. I looked carefully at all the faces. Were they going to scold me, or would they laugh? Luckily, all I had to do was laugh with the others. "That wasn't nice of you, Paula," said the good, kind, generous lady from the 3rd floor. "You must ask him to forgive you." Paula, blushing and smiling, made her way round the table through a circle of laughter and put a kiss on my forehead. I received the touch of her lips like a man condemned to the electric chair, and sat blushing, unable to move. Everyone recognized my emotion and called out, "Forgiven!" Paula herself waved a cheerful goodbye to us all and vanished through the door. "Paula! Paula! I would have liked— I didn't know what." I sat motionless, turned to stone, deaf to the conversation. They asked me about my parents, my former life. Thank God, not about the war. I answered evasively. Paula's kiss burned against my forehead like a hot cartridge case. I would gladly have done a daily patrol with her instead of with the war and 5 or 6 other soldiers. God damn it! It was late, and I would have liked an excuse to leave the table, but I had to sit patiently with these people for another hour until everyone was ready for bed. The Neubachs offered me Ernst's room. I thanked them effusively and explained that, for military reasons, I was required to return to the centre. In fact, I couldn't bear the thought of sleeping in my friend's bed. Also, I felt like walking through the streets. I might run into Paula. The Neubachs understood about military regulations and didn't insist. The lucky ones, who believed in some god, prayed. I was leaning against a pipe that transmitted every sound and vibration from the street. The roaring noise grew suddenly louder, crushing the air in our lungs. The room filled with cries of pain, and then with an intensified din, like the sound of 1,000 locomotives. Horrifying screams of terror, like screams from hell, rang through the darkness. The electric lights came on. Then the entire shelter filled with thick black dust, which poured in from the outside and engulfed us. We could hear some men shouting, "Shut that door!" The door slammed. We felt trapped in a communal grave. Some of the women broke down from nervous tension and began to howl and wave their arms wildly. We felt the floor shake 5 or 6 times, as if in the grip of some overpowering force. We were all terrified and clung together, despite a hideous sense of suffocation. An hour later, when the storm seemed to have died down, we left that ghastly hole. We were confronted by a scene worthy of Dante. The dark waters of the canal reflected the numerous fires ravaging its banks and destroying the structures which had given it some point. What was left of the tidy street and its white-edged sidewalks lay strewn with rubble between 2 giant crevasses. A constellation of sparks ascended into the summer sky in a rising column of acrid, suffocating smoke. People were running everywhere, and, as at Magdeburg, I was immediately impressed into a clean-up squad. After an exhausting night and most of the next morning, I finally found Paula, who was just as done in as I. The happiness I felt when she told me she had worried about me during the bombing erased the miseries of the night in a single stroke. "I was thinking of you too, Paula. I looked for you all night long." "Really?" she asked, in a tone that told me her sentiment was as strong as mine. I felt giddy with emotion. My eyes remained fixed on the young girl before me. I wanted passionately to take her in my arms and knew that I was blushing. She broke the silence. "I feel like a limp rag," she said. "Why don't we go out to the country, somewhere around Tempelhof? It might make us feel better." "That's a good idea, Paula. Let's go." I rode out with my first love in a little motorcycle taxi to the sandy countryside near the civil and military airfield at Tempelhof. We left the autobahn and climbed onto a small hillock covered with a kind of spongy lichen onto which we collapsed with delight. We both felt crushed by exhaustion. It was a marvellous day. Less than a mile away, the ground was cut up and crisscrossed by the network of airport runways, from which Focke-Wulf trainers leaped into the sky with astonishing speed. Paula lay on her back with her eyes closed, as if she were nearly asleep. I leaned on my elbow and stared at her, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. My head was filled with things to say to her, 1,000 amorous communications, but my mouth remained ludicrously shut. I felt that I should and must say everything to her right away, that they could wait no longer, that I must take advantage of this ideal moment and make her understand that it was idiotic to be so timid. Perhaps Paula was being deliberately silent, so that I would have a chance to speak. Time was passing, especially the time still left in my leave, but, despite all these considerations, my love for Paula imposed silence. She murmured, "The sun is so hot." I stammered a few stupidities. Finally, in a surge of courage, I slid my hand toward hers. The ends of our fingers touched, and I lingered for a moment at this delicious contact. Then I screwed up my courage so that my breath almost stopped, and Paula's hand was entirely mine. I grasped it fervently, and she didn't try to withdraw it. My shyness had presented me with a problem more taxing than finding a safe passage through a minefield. I lay stretched on my back for a moment longer, recovering my strength. I stared at the sky, overwhelmed with happiness, lost to the rest of the world. Paula turned her face toward me. Her eyes were still closed, and her hand gripped mine. I felt that I might faint. In a fever of emotion, I think I told her I loved her. Then I pulled myself together. I didn't know whether I had spoken or not. Paula hadn't moved. I must have been dreaming. Suddenly we turned our heads. The air was filled once again with the sinister sound of sirens howling in unison from the airport to the edge of the city. We stared at each other, astounded. "Can it be another raid?" This seemed unlikely. At that time, daytime raids near the capital were still extremely rare. However, the sirens were impossible to mistake. They were signalling the start of a raid, and we quickly believed them. Planes were rolling down all the runways, gathering speed. "The fighters are taking off, Paula. It really is a raid." "You're right. Look down there. All those people running to the shelter." "We should get into a shelter too, Paula." "But we're perfectly safe here. It's the country. They're going to bomb Berlin again." "I guess you're right. We're as well off here as in one of those airless holes." The German fighters roared over our heads. 10, 12, 13, 14, cried Paula, waving at the Fokker-Wulfs boring through the air over our heads. "Good luck to our pilots. 3 cheers for them." "Go on, boys," I shouted, to fall in with her mood. "Go on," Paula repeated. "It's not night time now. They'll be able to see. 22, 23, 24. How many there are? Hooray!" 30 fighters had taken off and were soaring into the sky. Their tactic was to climb as high as possible so that they could swoop down on the bombers from above and sting them in the back. The Luftwaffe had perfected the formidable Fokker-Wulf 190S and 195S, which could soar up quickly for precisely this purpose. We could hear the distant firing of anti-aircraft guns. "If we catch them that far away, they'll never even get to Berlin," Paula said. "I hope not, Paula." I had already forgotten about the damned raid, which had made me drop my girl's hand. Leaving the fighters to look out for themselves, I was preparing a second attack. I was already quite close to Paula when the roar of enemy bombers drowned out the sounds of the nearby city and overwhelmed us. "Oh, look, Gil," she said, as always mispronouncing my name. "They're coming from over there. Look!" With her delicate hand, she pointed to a huge mass of black dots that were steadily growing larger against the pale blue sky. "How high they are," she said. "And look, there are others over there." I stared at the double apparition bearing down on the city and on us. "My God, how many there are!" The noise grew louder and louder. "There must be hundreds of them." "It's impossible to count," Paula said. "They're still too far away." I began to feel afraid. For us, for her, for my happiness. "We've got to get away from here, Paula. It could get very dangerous." "Oh no," she said, unconcerned. "What would happen to us here?" "We could be strafed, Paula. We've got to find a shelter." I tried to drag her after me. "Look," she said, fascinated by the spectacle of danger growing visibly larger. "They're coming straight at us. And look at the white trails they make. Isn't it strange?" Now our flak went into action. On all sides, thousands of guns were spitting steel at the attackers. "Come quick," I said to Paula, tugging her hand. "We've got to get to a shelter." The shelters at the airfield were too far away for us now, so I pulled her toward a hollow in the ground beside a large tree. "Where are our fighters?" cried Paula, gasping for breath. "Perhaps they've run away. There are so many enemy planes." "You mustn't say that. German soldiers never run away." "But what can they do, Paula? There must be at least 1,000 bombers." "You have no right to say that about our heroic pilots." "Forgive me, Paula. You're right. I would be astonished if they ran away." The thunder of bombs once again filled the air of the martyred city. German soldiers never run away. I, who had run from the Don to Kharkov, knew that perfectly well, although it must be admitted that German soldiers could fight against odds as great as 30-1, as in Russia, for instance. From the hole into which Paula and I had dived, we were able to watch the avalanche that flattened a third of the airfield and 90% of Tempelhof. The daytime raids were always stronger than the ones at night. On that particular day, 1,100 British and American planes attacked the Berlin region, opposed by roughly 60 fighters. The heavy American losses were caused largely by flak. At least 100 planes were shot down. The German fighters had not run away. Not a single German plane came through undamaged. I can still see very clearly the whistling clusters of bombs falling 7,000 or 8,000 feet onto Tempelhof and the airfield, and feel the earth trembling under their giant blows. I can see the ground cracking and houses bursting into flame, and the oil depots near the field spreading the flames over hundreds of yards. I can see a suburb of 150,000 people blotted out in a blanket of smoke, and with my eyes involuntarily wide from the shock, I can see trees tearing upward from the ground in groups of 10 or 12, and hear them ripping open the earth. I can hear doomed planes roaring their engines, and see them spinning, exploding, falling, and I can see the terror in Paula's eyes as she pressed herself against me. Flaming debris was falling all around us, so we made ourselves as small as we could at the bottom of our hole. Paula hid her face between my shoulder and my cheek, and I could feel her trembling, quite apart from the trembling of the earth. Pressed together like two lost children, we watched helplessly. Long after the planes had gone, delayed action bombs were exploding in Tempelhof, where the raid had taken 22,000 lives. Berlin had received a battering too, and its rescue services were completely overwhelmed. The streets were still strewn with wreckage from the night raid, Spandau was still burning, and in the southwest quarter of the city, delayed action bombs were still exploding 15 hours later. Tempelhof was shrieking with pain. When we stumbled from our hole, haggard with exhaustion, Paula clung to my arm. Her nerves were strained to their utmost, and she couldn't stop trembling. "Gil," she said, "I feel terrible, and look at me. I'm filthy." She seemed to have lost control of her reason. Her head fell back on my shoulder. Without even thinking, I kissed her on the forehead. She made no effort to stop me. I was unable to reassemble the thoughts that had obsessed me at the beginning of our walk. I no longer felt any hesitation about kissing my friend. We seemed to have passed beyond the stage of infantile flirting. I kissed her hair as if I were consoling an anxious child, and saw, through her tears, the tears of the child in Magdeburg, shaking with sobs. I thought of Ernst, of all the tears in this war, and all the anguish. I tried to feel pity and to show it. My happiness was mixed with too much suffering. I couldn't simply accept it and forget all the rest. My love for Paula seemed somehow impossible in this setting of permanent chaos. As long as children were crying in the dust of their crumbled homes, I would never be able to live with my love. Nothing seemed certain. Perhaps nothing would survive this marvellous spring day except my love for Paula, and I didn't know how to declare it. 3/4 of the sky was darkened by smoke from the thousands of fires which were burning at Tempelhof, along the autobahns, and in Berlin. I looked from Paula's blonde hair to the ravaged landscape. Once more we fell down on the grass. I didn't know what to say to comfort her. When we had regained some of our strength, we walked slowly down the autobahn. There, truckloads of rescue workers were driving toward Tempelhof. Without any signal, a truck stopped beside us. "Come on, you young ones! They need you down there!" We looked at each other. "Yes, we're just coming. Paula, I'll help you climb up." The trucks were picking up everyone they met. One section of the city was abandoned so that another, at least, might be saved. We worked for hours, pulling out the wounded. The Hitlerjugend from a nearby hostel volunteered for the most dangerous jobs, in search of heroism. Many of them were killed, disappearing in the torrential collapse of burning timber frames. We managed to find a refuge late that night, in an apartment that had been 3/4 destroyed. Dizzy with fatigue, we collapsed onto a bed and lay there, too tired to speak, staring into the darkness with wide-open eyes. Thousands of luminous butterflies seemed to be dancing in front of us. They looked as solid and tangible as living creatures. My retina, stamped with the lights of the fires, continued to light my inner vision. One of Paula's hands twisted a button on my dusty tunic. "Do you think we can sleep here?" she said. "I don't know, but anyway. If anyone found us here, we might get into trouble." What could she be thinking of? I don't care. I'm too tired. Paula, who was sucking one of her skinned fingers, said nothing. I slid my hand under her head, and fully prepared to affront God or the devil, pulled her to me, kissing her passionately, as her torn hands stroked my hair. We were trying to catch up with what life had denied us that afternoon, but quickly succumbed to sleep, overcome by exhaustion. We spent all the next day cleaning up. It took about a week to restore some kind of functional order. However, in the evening we were relieved by fresh volunteers, who had been rounded up so that the first group could return to their usual occupations. Luckily for me, I was not impressed into any obligatory duties, although as a soldier on leave, I was not involved in any essential activities. 2 more days went by, during which I hardly left Paula's side. Every morning I brought a fresh supply of chocolates and cigarettes from my father's package for us to consume together. The capital was binding up its wounds and burying its dead. Long funeral processions twisted through the streets. The heroic city was returning to its usual productive rhythm. I only had 5 days left and felt oppressed and anguished by the prospect of departure. Paula, who dreaded it as much as I did, tried to fill my mind with other thoughts. Luckily, there were no further raids. The Neubachs had lost all their windows and had to repair a section of their roof. 3 bombs had fallen only 150 yards away, on the square, which now looked like a street in Minsk. Paula's mother, whom I had met, began to think it rather strange that her daughter never left my side. We met every evening as well as every day, but she took the times into account and raised no objection. Paula, who had more money than I did, took me to the movies one evening. We saw a film called Immensee, based on a poem about water lilies. We lived this way until the day of my departure. I was due at the Silesian station at 7 in the evening. The Neubachs were touching in their expressions of goodwill when I said goodbye to them. They understood that I wished to spend my last hours with the girl they considered my fiancée. Frau Neubach insisted on giving me a heavy pullover which had belonged to Ernst. Her husband gave me cigars, soap, and 2 boxes of tinned food. They both embraced me and made me promise to come and see them on my next leave. I assured them I would, and that I'd send them my news from time to time. I asked them to look out for Paula. "You love her, don't you?" Frau Neubach asked me gently. "Oh yes, Frau Neubach." Despite an attempt at calm, my voice rang with emotion. I kissed them both and left. At the reception centre, the Feld gave Paula permission to go up to the dormitory with me and help me pack. I could feel my throat knotting with sorrow. How long would it be before I saw Paula again? We repeated over and over again how much we loved each other and began to feel somewhat calmer. I would certainly have another leave in 3 or 4 months, and Paula, of course, would wait for me. She swore that she would write to me every day, that soon we would belong to each other, that we would marry. Her warm lips murmured this to me 1,000 times as we kissed. The war must end soon. It can't go on like this. We can't have another horrible winter like the one last year. Everyone had suffered more than enough, and the fighting would have to stop. We felt sure of it. We arrived at the Silesian station to find that the departure platform had been moved to another position half a mile away because of bomb damage. Paula walked beside me, smiling despite her emotion. She was carrying a package which she wanted to give me at the last minute. The platform was decorated with pennants and flags to salute the long line of men returning to the east. We stopped beside the first carriage of the Poznan train. I shoved my bulging sack inside and turned back to catch a moment of unguarded sadness on Paula's face. "Don't be sad, beloved. I love you so much." I stood for a long time, holding her hands, unable to think of anything else to say. I longed to hold her in my arms, but this was forbidden in public. People walked by, talking. The cement platform rang with the sound of the metalled boots of fellows in the same position as myself. But my eyes were glued to Paula. I was oblivious of everyone and everything else. The hour of departure had almost arrived. A shiver ran through my body and made my hands tremble. A station master in a red cap was walking down the platform, calling out the stops ahead. Poznan, Warsaw, Lublin, Lvov, Russia. These words crushed my sense of happiness. I braced myself for the whistle which would interrupt our last moment. "Paula!" The station master continued his list of distant destinations. Paula, what would it have been without you? Auf Wiedersehen, mein Lieber, Paula whispered in tears. Paula, I beg you, don't cry. Please. You know I'll be back soon. Ich weiß, mein Lieber, auf morgen Gila. A section was tramping by on the other side of the tracks, singing gaily, Erica, we love you, Erica, we love you. And that's why we'll come back. That's why we'll come back. You see, Paula, even the song says so. Listen. I felt overwhelmed by the words. I would come back only for Paula. That's what the song meant to say. Then the whistle demolished my sense of joy. I pulled Paula to me and embraced her wildly. Einsteigen! Los! Reisende einsteigen! Achtung! Passagiere einsteigen! Achtung! Achtung! I love you, Paula. We'll see each other soon. Don't be sad. See how beautiful it is today. We can't be sad. Paula was inconsolable, and I felt that I was going to burst into tears myself. I kissed her for the last time. The couplings of the carriages clashed. The train was beginning to move. I jumped onto the step of the carriage. Paula clung to my hand. The train slowly gathered speed. Many of the people standing on the platform were crying, and soldiers leaning halfway out the windows were still hanging on to someone's hand or kissing a child. Paula ran beside us as long as she could. Then she had to let go. See you soon, my love. The day was so beautiful we should have been leaving for a day in the country. I stood on the step for a long time, watching the outline of my beloved growing smaller and smaller, and finally disappearing forever. I will soon come back, Paula, but I never went back. I never saw Paula again, or Berlin, or Killerringstrasse, or the Neubachs. Paula, we'll be married, I swear it, but the war prevented me from keeping my word, and the peace made it lose all its value. France reminded me of that severely enough. So please forgive me, Paula. It wasn't all my fault. You knew the misery of war too, and fear and anguish. Perhaps, and I wish it with all my heart, perhaps you also were spared. That at least would allow us both to remember. The war destroyed Berlin and Germany and Killerringstrasse, and perhaps the Neubachs too, but not you, Paula. That would be too horrible. I have forgotten nothing. Whenever I close my eyes, I relive our marvellous moments, and hear once again the sound of your voice, and smell your hair, and feel your kisses. And the song, Erica, we love you, Erica, we love you. And that's why we'll come back, that's why we'll come back. Lenson was laughing, but I knew that he had meant every word. Look, he said, there's another of our gang. Where? Over there, the big fellow who thinks he's so tough. Hulls. I jumped down from the carriage. Whoever quits the nest loses his nook, someone shouted. Hey, Hulls! I was already running to meet him. I could see his face lighting up. Sager, I was wondering how I'd ever find you in this mob. Lenson saw you. Is he here too? We turned back to the train. Too late, boys. Full up. That's what you think, shouted Hulls, grabbing the legs of one of the kibitzers and pulling him down onto the platform on his backside. Everybody laughed, and with a jump we were on board. Well, that's fine, said the fellow Hulls had dislodged, rubbing his backside. If this goes on, we'll be jammed in here like frankfurters in a box, and there won't be any room to sleep. So it's you, you bastard, said Hulls, giving me a long stare. I've been waiting to hear from you for 2 solid weeks. I'm really sorry, but when I tell you what happened, you'd better make it good. It got so that I really didn't know what to say to my parents. I gave my friend an account of my misadventures. God damn it, Hulls said. They certainly fucked you up, didn't they? If you'd only listened to me. We could have gone to Dortmund together. Plenty of alerts there too, of course, but the planes only passed over. You got it right in the neck. Well, that's life, I answered in a mock melancholy tone. In reality, of course, the experiences of my leave left no regrets. If I had gone straight home with Hulls, I would never have met Paula. And Paula had been able to obliterate for me all the sights and sounds of Tempelhof's blazing fires. You certainly have a long face, Hals said, commiserating with me. But I didn't feel like talking. Hals quickly understood and left me to myself. We were sprawled on the straw like animals, trying to sleep. Each piercing jolt of the wheels passing over the joints in the rails seemed to be adding to the barrier separating Paula from me. We passed through villages and towns and forests, all as dark as the night, and distances that stretched into infinity. The train seemed indefatigable, unending. At daybreak we were still rolling, and 3 hours later we were in Lower Poland, crossing the Pinsk marshes, parallel to the rough, rutted roads pockmarked by war, washed with sadness, and with the sweat of the armies that had tramped along them. The sky seemed inordinately large and filled with the summer that the earth was denied. I fell asleep several times. Each time I woke, the jolting wheels were still striking the same 2 notes. Finally, the train slowed down and stopped. The locomotive was resupplied with coal and water at a pitiful hovel which passed for a station. We all jumped down onto the ballast, made of God knows what, to relieve ourselves. There was no question of official nourishment. German troop transports at that period were officially considered to be without that category of need, and no food would be distributed before Korostan. Luckily, nearly everyone had brought supplies from home, which is what the Quartermaster General was counting on. The train resumed its eastward journey. Hals tried to engage me in conversation several times, but always without success. I would have liked to tell him about Paula, but I was afraid he'd treat it as a joke. We reached Korostan at nightfall, and were ordered to disembark and line up beside a mess truck, which produced a revolting gruel. I felt very far from the excellent cooking of Frau X. When we had eaten, we all went to rinse our tins and drink at the tank that held water for the locomotives. Then we set out again on a Russian train, which was no more comfortable than the one we'd just left, and into another eternity eastward. Trains were moving non-stop toward the front, both day and night. We had nearly reached our sector in less than 3 days. The southern front, where fierce fighting was underway at Kremenchug, had shifted, but our sector seemed almost unchanged. Our exhausting railway journey came to an end at Romny, where we had met with so many difficulties on the way out. From the train, we were herded straight to the canteen, where we were given food and drink to quiet us, as if we were frantic sheep on the way to the slaughterhouse. Then, with a haste that gave us no time to think, the military police called us out for our various units. It was very hot, and we would have been glad for a chance to sleep. A great many idle Russians stood and watched us, as though they were watching a fairground being prepared for a fair. When our group for the Gross Deutschland was called out, we were told to follow a sidecar, which led us to the edge of town. Instead of staying in first or slowing down his machine, the bastard forced us onto the double. Heavily loaded in that heat, we were nearly choking when we arrived at our designated position. The climbed down from his sidecar, called the other non-coms to whom he distributed our marching orders, and divided up our group. In sections of 40 or 50 at a time, we marched off to our new camp. As we were commanded by fellows who were also just back from leave, and none too anxious to return to the firing line, we made numerous stops before arriving at Camp F of the Gross Deutschland Division, about 20 miles from Romny and over 100 from Belgorod, out in the country like Akhtirka. In this training camp for an elite division, all divisions with names instead of numbers were considered elite. One sweated blood and water. One was either hospitalized after a week of almost insane effort or incorporated into the division and marched off to the war, which was even worse. We entered the camp through a large symbolic gateway cut into the trees of the forest which stretched away thickly to the northeast. Although we were marching in step, as we'd been ordered to do, and singing Die Wolken ziehen at the tops of our lungs, we were still able to read the slogan which decorated the impressive entrance in large black letters against a white ground. I don't think anyone could pass through that gate without a swallow of fear. A little further on, another sign bore the words. Our non-coms marched us in impeccable order to the right-hand side of the rough courtyard and ordered us to halt. A huge walked over to us, flanked by 2 shouted our group leader. The giant captain saluted us with a slow but definitive gesture. Then he walked up and down our ranks, giving each of us a long stare. He was at least a head taller than anybody else. Even hulls seemed small beside this impressive personage. When he had petrified each of us with his astonishingly hard stare, he stepped back and rejoined the two who were standing as still as the cedars of Jussieu. "Good morning, gentlemen." His words sounded like stakes being driven into the earth. "I can see on your faces that you've all been enjoying your leaves, and I'm very glad to see it." Even the birds seemed to have been stilled by the sound of that voice. "However, tomorrow you shall have to think of the work which must absorb all of us." A dust-covered company had marched up to the gateway, but had stopped short in order not to interrupt the captain's speech. "Tomorrow, a period of training begins for you, which will turn you into the best fighting men in the world. Feldwebel!" he shouted in a voice even louder. "Revile at sunrise for the new section. Jawohl, Herr Hauptmann. Good evening, gentlemen." He turned on his heel, then changed his mind, gesturing with one finger for the group of men at the gate to come in. When the fellows, stripped to the waist and grey with dust, drew even with us, he stopped them with a similar tiny gesture. "Here are some new friends," he said, addressing himself to both groups. "Salute each other, please." 300 men, their faces drawn with exhaustion, made a quarter turn to the right and saluted, shouting, "Thank you, comrades, for joining us." We presented arms, and the captain walked off, looking very pleased with himself. As soon as he was gone, the two Feldwebels who'd come with him chased us off to the barracks as if they'd suddenly gone mad. "You've got 4 minutes to settle in," they shouted. Forgetting our tiredness, we were presently standing at attention at the feet of our double-decker beds. Our non-coms, who were clearly terrified, called the roll under the baleful eyes of the two Kampfelds, who then explained what. A short distance away, in the dim half-light, we could see another group of soldiers jumping to the bark of another watchdog. In no time we had washed and were lined up in front of our barracks. Luckily, we had reached the first days of July, so we didn't have to worry about the cold. Then the Feldwebel chose one of us to put the rest through a gymnastic routine until he came back. We had to stretch our arms in various directions, touch first the tips of our toes, and then the ground to the right and to the left, at the greatest possible extension, and begin again. "Get going," he said as he went off. "And no stopping." We turned and stretched in this way for nearly 15 minutes. When the Feldwebel came back and ordered us to stop, our heads were spinning. "You have 45 seconds to get back here in battle order. Raus!" 45 seconds later, 150 steel helmets topping 150 men, whose pulses were racing to the explosion point, lined up facing the flag. It was then that we made the acquaintance of Herr Hauptmann Fink and his formidable training methods. He arrived wearing riding breeches and carrying a whip under his arm. "Stillgestanden," ordered the Feldwebel. The captain stopped at the appropriate distance, made a slow half-turn and saluted the flag. We were ordered to present arms. "At ease," he said in a calm voice, turning back to us. "Feldwebel, you will simply accompany us today. In honour of the new section, I myself am going to drill them." He shifted his weight and stared down at the ground, which was already lit by the sun. Then he jerked up his head again. "Attention!" In 1/100th of a second we were standing at attention. "Very good," he said in a honeyed voice. He walked toward the first row of men. "Gentlemen, I have the impression that you perhaps entered the infantry a trifle hastily, without sufficient reflection. You probably do not realize that the specialized infantry, such as we are here, has nothing in common with what you knew in the auxiliary service, which you voluntarily quit. Not one of you seems adequate to the job we have to do. I hope that I am wrong, that you will prove the contrary to me, that you will not oblige me to send you to a disciplinary unit to teach you that you have made a mistake." We listened to him transfixed, with empty heads and rapt attention. "The task which you will all have to assume sooner or later will certainly require more of you than you supposed. Simply maintaining a decent level of morale and knowing how to handle a weapon will no longer be enough. You will also require a very great deal of courage, perseverance, endurance, and resistance in any situation. We of the Gross Deutschland have merited mention in the official communiques which are published throughout the Reich, and this is an honour not lightly bestowed. To deserve this honour we need men, and not pitiful specimens like you. I must warn you that everything here is hard, nothing is forgiven, and that everyone in consequence must have quick reflexes. We didn't know how we ought to receive this tirade. "Attention!" he shouted. "Down on the ground and full length!" Without a moment's hesitation, we were all stretched out on the sandy soil. Then Captain Fink stepped forward, and, like someone strolling down a beach, walked across the human ground, continuing his speech as his boots, loaded with at least 200 pounds, trampled the paralysed bodies of our section. His heels calmly crushed down on a back, a hip, a head, or a hand, but no one moved. "Today," he said, "I am going to take you for a little outing so I can judge your abilities for myself." He divided us into two groups, one of 100, the other of 50. "Today, gentlemen," he said, addressing himself to the group of 50, to which neither Hulls nor I belonged, "it will be your privilege to assume the role of the supposed wounded. Tomorrow it will be your turn to look out for your comrades. Wounded section on the ground." Then he turned to us. "In twos! Pick up the wounded." Hulls and I made a seat of our hands for a wincing fellow who must have weighed at least 170 pounds. Then Captain Fink led us to the camp exit. We walked as far as a low hill, which seemed to be about 3/4 of a mile away. Our arms felt as though they would break under the weight of our comrade, who gradually grew used to the situation. When we reached the top of the hillock, we had to climb down the other side. Our boots cracked as we stumbled down the steep slope. By now the day had turned hot, and we began to run with sweat. Every so often an exhausted man let his grip slip for an instant, and the supposed victim slid to the ground. Whenever this occurred, Fink, with the help of his Feldwebel, would separate the enfeebled trio from the main body of men and assign them an even heavier load. Each man would have to carry another on his back. At the bottom of the slope, I sensed that it was going to be my turn. "I can't go on, Hulls. My wrists are giving way. I've got to let go." "You're crazy. You can't. Would you rather lug him all by yourself?" "I know, Hulls, but I really can't help it." "Keep going," said the captain. Loss. Hulls tightened his grip on my hands to keep me from letting go. We could hear the men behind us gasping for breath and stumbling on the rocky ground under the weight of a comrade and full equipment. The Feldwebel was trying to keep them going, urging them on with a torrent of abuse. Hulls, who was a great deal stronger than I, clenched his teeth. Each crease in his face was pouring with sweat. "I'm sorry, boys," said the fellow we were carrying. "I'd gladly walk this if they'd only let me." We somehow managed to stagger to the next wooded hill, which we climbed with almost unbearable effort. By now the wretched fellows with their separate burdens had dropped far behind us, still relentlessly pursued by the Feldwebel. The captain never took his eyes off us. With every yard we were expecting the order to halt, but every yard was followed by another, which was still more difficult. My numbed hands were now entirely without circulation. "I can't stand it any more, Hulls. Let go." Hulls clenched his teeth and didn't answer. The pain and pressure had become so great that I'd lost my grip altogether, and Hulls was hanging on alone. The groups of men who had broken apart were straggling over a wide distance. Captain Fink reorganized them into couples. Then it was our turn. I shook my bloodless hands and heaved a long sigh. The giant shadow of the captain loomed over me, and I was ordered to lift a man heavier than myself onto my trembling shoulders. But the shift in position was a relief. Although my head was swimming, I was able to keep going. This torture went on for nearly an hour, until we were all on the point of losing consciousness and at the extreme limit of our capacities, which Captain Fink seemed to be deliberately overestimating. Finally, he decided to shift us to a new exercise. "Since you all seem to be tired," I shall now assign you a lying down exercise, which may revive you. Picture to yourselves that over there behind that hill there is a nest of Bolshevik resistance." He gestured toward a hillock about a half-mile away. "Furthermore," he went on in a jovial tone, "imagine that you have the best of reasons for taking that hill, but that if you walk over there on your feet, the Bolsheviks will make it their business to lay you flat. Therefore, you will make yourselves even flatter than the ground and proceed toward your objective on your bellies. I shall precede you and shall fire on anyone I see. Understood?" We gaped at him, astounded. He was already walking away from us, pulling his Mauser from the holster on his belt. The few minutes he needed to reach the hill gave us a chance to breathe, almost the only chance we were to have during our 3 weeks of training. We kept our eyes glued to the Hauptmann, who had gone to take up his position, wondering if we had heard him correctly. On the Feldwebel's orders, we threw ourselves down on our stomachs and began to squirm forward. The Feldwebel ran to join the captain, and we drew slowly closer to the rocky outcrop. Hals was struggling along on my left. We had covered about 4/5 of the distance when the tiny silhouette of the captain appeared against the sky. He began firing almost at once. We hesitated for a moment, wondering what was happening, but the Feldwebel's whistle was still summoning us forward. The captain must have been under orders to avoid undue damage to his trainees. Otherwise, I am sure he wouldn't have hesitated to aim true. His bullets whistled down among us until we had reached our objective. The game was not entirely without danger. During our 3 weeks of training, we buried 4 companions to the strains of Ich hat einen Kameraden, victims of so-called training accidents. There were also about 20 wounded, with injuries ranging from a long infected scratch received during a crawl through a barbed wire entanglement to a wound from a bullet or a fragment of shrapnel, to a limb crushed by the track of a training tank. We also pulled out 2 fellows who had nearly drowned crossing a piece of water on waterlogged wooden crosses made of old railway ties. We were sent on interminable marches. One day we spent hours following the edge of a swamp on the waterside, while another section fired at us, forcing us to remain submerged up to our chins. During that particular game, everyone's head was down in earnest. We were trained to hurl grenades, both offensive and defensive, on a carefully prepared piece of ground. We were given bayonet practice and exercises to develop balance, in which 1 in 5 cracked his head, and tests of endurance which seemed to last forever. One of these, for instance, took place in an old conduit, which must have been used to supply several towns with gas. It was made of 2 elbows, and the fellows in the middle learned all about the horrors of claustrophobia. There were many thousands of similar tests. In addition, there was the famous Harteibung, which was almost continuous. We were put on 36-hour shifts, which were broken by only 3 half-hour periods, during which we devoured the contents of our mess tins, before returning to the ranks in an obligatory clean and orderly condition. At the end of these 36 hours, we were allowed 8 hours of rest. Then there was another 36-hour period, after which everything began all over again. There were also false alarms, which tore us from our leaden sleep and forced us into the courtyard fully dressed and equipped in record time, before we could return to our uncomfortable beds.